welcome and good morning to the webinar on partnerships for endpoint assessments. My name is Rohini Bhattacharya and I'm the head of apprenticeship services for Pearson. And my role is really to look at the end-to-end offer and our services for endpoint assessments, looking at creating the endpoint assessment instruments and also the support offer for providers and employers. So we're going to talk about endpoint assessments and partnerships. Just bear with me. Let me just see why this is not moving forward. Here we go. Okay. So talking about the apprenticeship new standards and specifically around partnerships, I suppose for yourselves as providers, you would be interested to find out why you should be working in partnership with Pearson. So here are a few pointers why you might be thinking or have already thought about partnerships. Within the provider networks, obviously, you've got the resource base for qualified assessors who have occupational competence already. As providers, you are working with the local employers already. And so when it comes to offering apprenticeships within the employer landscape, there is an issue around the accessibility to the employers, accessibility of infrastructure, the trust that you build up with the employers, especially your local employers and the small and medium enterprises within your region. So those are some of the issues which might prompt you to think about working in partnership and delivering endpoint assessments on behalf of Pearson within your local area. The endpoint assessment landscape is also a very new area for most of us, and trying to understand the end game that you're trying to get to would help your delivery on the on-program element as well. So that might be one of the reasons you might be thinking about partnerships. We also think that working as an endpoint assessor for Pearson is a massive opportunity for the workforce in terms of the assessors, and we can actually look at this as a CPD opportunity for them as well. So those might be some of the reasons you might be thinking about partnerships. Within Pearson, we have developed certain principles for partnership working, and the reasons why we've developed these principles is because our role as an endpoint assessment accountable organization is a non-negotiable position with the Education and Skills Funding Agency. And so we need to bed down or lay down certain basic principles on the basis of which we will have a consistent partnership working arrangements with providers or employers. So I'm going to outline a few of the principles, well, some of the principles which essentially forms our framework for partnership working. So within Pearson, we are very clear that we are going to work with organizations who have the capacity, capability, and the suitable independence in delivering endpoint assessments. And I'll detail about the independence in the next few slides. So these organizations can be FE colleges, they can be private training providers, they can be employer providers, or they can be indeed training providers who are setting up a separate assessment entity as well. We are very, very clear that for all purposes, Pearson remains the endpoint assessment accountable and responsible body. As I mentioned briefly, that role is completely non-negotiable for us. We are happy to work with intermediary organizations, and indeed we have started having conversations with a lot of these across England. However, we are clear that our contractual relationship in working in partnership would be with the organization that is employing the assessors. And that's primarily because of the legal requirements around HR and contractual legal relationships. When we look at different partners, we will be undertaking what we call due diligence checks on the potential partners. We will be looking at the quality assurance for EPA Delivery. As a EPA accountable and responsible organization, we are responsible for the validity and comparability of the endpoint assessments. And the conflict of interest checks is something that the ESFA are very, very keen for us to get right. And there will be checks and balances that we put in place to make sure that when we are working with partners in the local regional areas, we have checks and balances in place to actually make sure that there is no conflict of interest. So what that means is through our due diligence process, and I'll explain that in a bit more detail, we would need to have visibility of the assessor-apprentice interactions, and that can be through a consistent system which both we and the partner have access to. It can be an interaction between the systems where you can log into our system for us to have that visibility and control. We can provide evidence to the ESFA around our accountable and responsible role as an endpoint assessment organization. We have been speaking to the ESFA around our intentionality to work in partnership with the different types of partners. And what the ESFA have asked us to do is to make sure that we get an agreement in principle from the ESFA before we actually sign contractual agreements with providers and intermediary organizations. This is probably in the first few months. So I would think this is probably in the first 18 months of our partnership work, simply because the ESFA would like to have visibility of the types of partnerships which are springing up in different parts of the country, and what the implication that has from their perspective in terms of regulation and making sure that there is sufficient independence in the arrangements of partnerships and that keep coming up. So it's a direct dialogue that we have been having with the ESFA. They are very keen to see these partnerships growing up because obviously the new apprenticeship standards is a new landscape, and they understand that capacity within the different sectors is an issue in terms of finding those occupationally competent assessors who would be able to carry out the endpoint assessments. So coming on to the types of partnerships that we are looking at and some of the processes that we are putting in place now to initiate these partnerships. The two categories, the broad categories of partnerships that we're looking at are for the endpoint assessment development side of things and for the endpoint assessment delivery side of things. So I'll just walk through a brief diagram on what that looks like. So Pearson UK is the endpoint assessment organization, and we are looking at partnerships for both EPA development and EPA delivery. The types of organizations who we potentially think would be interested in working with us in partnership would be either a consortium of employers or individual large employers. They might be intermediary organizations, which might be typically either a membership organization or a consortium of providers who've come together in a local area. Or it can be a group of training providers or a large national training provider or a consortia of providers getting together. All of these different types of organizations, we are looking to them to provide occupationally competent staff. So occupationally competent staff who can input into the development side of our endpoint assessment, or occupationally competent staff who can be used to actually deliver endpoint assessments on behalf of Pearson. In either of these arrangements, whether it's for development or delivery, we will have contractual relationships with the organization that we are sourcing the assessors or the occupational competent staff from. So in case of the development activity, we will have a memorandum of understanding if it's a consortia agreement, if it's a consortia that's come together, or we can have a contractual agreement if it's a specific legal entity that we are contracting with for the supply of occupationally competent staff. And from a perspective of the EPA delivery, we will have an assessor-supplier contract in place with the organization. So on the EPA delivery side of things, we are looking at these occupational competent staff to deliver endpoint assessments on behalf of Pearson. On the development side, the kind of inputs that these occupationally competent staff would have input into would be things like item writing workshops for a multiple choice test, for example, or it can be sort of defining the scenarios that feed into maybe the professional discussion, which is one of the components of one of these endpoint assessments. I mean, these are just two of the scenarios. Obviously, there's a whole lot of different types of assessment instruments that need to be developed across the different standards. And we think that it's only when you actually work in that sector or work in that particular role within that standard, within that sector, you would have that insight, which then needs to feed into the endpoint assessment that takes place. So that's broadly how we are envisaging the development and delivery partnerships to take shape. I'll just walk through a quick process of what we expect when we are looking at selecting this independent assessor from the partnership organization. So we will create the job description for this independent assessor, which is based on the requirements that are specified or detailed within the assessment plan. We will put this up on the website, or we can actually carry out an open day if it's a large regional provider or a consortia. We're happy to do that. Interested candidates can apply with their CVs to become an independent assessor, and we will carry out the assessor interviews and selection process. We can either do this independently ourselves, or we can also do this with our partner organization as well. It does depend on the size of the potential partner organization that we're looking at. But we're happy to do the assessors and selection and recruitment process for the assessors in partnership. The assessor, once they have been selected, and this is primarily at least 6 months prior to the first EPA date, which we have a record of as part of our ongoing tracking and monitoring system. Once the assessors have been selected, we will carry out the training and standardization events for those assessors. And these can be, initially, we would expect these to be a face-to-face event because endpoint assessment is still early in the early stages of development. However, subsequently, we would expect refresher training to be delivered online through webinars like this one on a regular basis. On a quarterly basis, we would have refresher training that's delivered online. In terms of the support offer that we give to these assessors, obviously, we will be creating the assessment instruments. We do have an assessor handbook, which is specific to endpoint assessments. We are finalizing our EPA code of conduct for the assessors to follow. So any assessor, either directly deployed by ourselves or in partnership with an organization, would be expected to follow the EPA code of conduct. We will define a CPD framework. So while we haven't got a framework that's ready for the endpoint assessors, we expect that we will create a CPD framework which will actually be able to create a pathway or a progression pathway for the assessors on endpoint assessment. So maybe a gold, silver, bronze kind of a category where which gives a visibility for an assessor to actually work through the different levels. And obviously we'll be having quality assurance and monitoring frameworks, which we would expect the assessors to follow, and some training around the systems and data inputs as well, because there's quite a lot of interactions and recording that needs to happen between the assessor and the apprentice and the endpoint assessor organization. We will look at assessor allocations and scheduling as well. Again, this is an activity which potentially an intermediary organization is also looking to take accountability for or responsibility for, and we're happy to do that. Obviously, it needs a level of detail to understand what that looks like, what kind of systems are involved, how these systems interact with each other, so we can actually evidence to the ESFA the visibility that we would have on the interactions between the assessors and the apprentice on an ongoing basis. We are putting in place what we call lead independent EPA assessors. So all assessors that we deploy from our partner organizations would get support from a dedicated lead independent endpoint assessor who sits within Pearson. This might be on a sector-by-sector basis based on the volumes that we deliver for the endpoint assessments, or it can be based on a regional partnership, which is big enough for us to have a dedicated independent EPA for that area. What we're also putting in place from our little experience that we have so far is what we call a first accompanied visit for the assessor. So because, again, endpoint assessments are a different kettle of fish than the normal assessments that we do for work-based learning, our first assessor, a new assessor who does their first assessment, would have an accompanied visit from the lead EPA assessor. And then the other support that the assessors would get from the lead EPA assessor would be ongoing standardization, CPD activities, quality assurance monitoring and training, and everything that goes around satisfying the requirements from the external quality assurance body. And all of these ongoing activities would then feed into our assessments instruments, our handbook, our whole quality assurance framework for endpoint assessments. So this is how we think our assessor selection, recruitment, training, standardization, and quality assurance framework is going to work on an ongoing basis. Of course, there'll be more changes coming up, and we'll review these as and when required. So just a few details around sort of operationalizing the partnership, and I'm talking about this operational detail from a delivery, from an EPA delivery perspective, not the development side of things. So we've thought through what are the different stages that's involved, and I'll give you a process chart in a bit. But in terms of due diligence for the partners, the kind of things that we would be looking at would be things like the kind of capacity you have available within your assessor pool, the occupational competence for each of the specific sectors for the standards, the management and staffing arrangements you have within your organization, kind of internal QA processes, existing apprenticeship contracts. Some of these are already covered within our center approval process. So if you are a Pearson approved center, we will not duplicate what we have asked you already. However, if you've completed your center approval form a long time ago, then we might revisit that because things do change in this sector a lot. So if you have only recently been approved as a EPA center, as a center for Pearson, we will only ask or visit those questions which are not covered within the approval form. But we will carry out a due diligence for each partner organization or potential partner organization. In terms of signing of contractual agreements with the individual partner, we would do this once we've had a satisfactory result from the due diligence exercise previously. And the contractual agreement would have details of the standards that we'll be deploying the partner organization for EPA delivery, the number of assessors that you have indicated are available to do this, the location and geographical coverage that they would be able to cover, approximate time availability. I know it's very difficult to pin that down, and also the price per assessor for the different standards. And this price can be on a per apprentice or per EPA basis or a per day basis. I think it does depend from sector to sector as to which is the more viable model. We will have an assessor management framework in place, and this will be down to detailed discussions and negotiations with the partner organization. And the kind of details that we'll be working to get this bedded down would be the organizational level management that's required. So who within your organization or within the consortium would have this list of or bank of assessor details, and how do they go about scheduling or allocating the assessors based on the demand from the market, and then making sure that there is no conflict of interest. So for example, if we are going to have a endpoint assessment contract with an employer in your region, how do you ensure that nobody from your organization has actually been involved in delivering training to that apprentice within that organization? So we need to have evidence to make sure that we can actually prove that there is no conflict of interest there. And then there are sort of administration issues, including allocations, invoicing. All those details need to be bedded down, and we're making sure that we understand both from a partner's perspective and our perspective in terms of the liability for assessors and the CPD that takes care. And of course, we've talked about the quality assurance framework, and that's something that we would bed in terms of providing training to the assessors, but also making sure that we monitor and track that on a regular basis to evidence that for our benefit. So from your perspective, if you were to be involved in initiating a partnership with Pearson, this is a rough process map that you would need to go through. So there is an initial expression of interest form that we would want you to fill out, and your account managers would have the details to that. We'll come to that in a little bit later on. So you fill out an initial expression of interest form, which has a certain amount of details, which gather details on the requirements that we would need you to detail out within the form. Once you've filled out that or completed that form and submitted to your account manager, we will then get into in-depth discussions and negotiations based on some of the operational details that I talked about previously. Once we're happy with that, we will go through a due diligence process on all of our partner or potential partner organizations. And based on the outcome of that due diligence, we would then enter into contractual agreements, MOUs, or service level agreements. Once we've done that, that then feeds into our internal process for signing off that partnership agreement. And once it's been signed off at the FMT level internally within Pearson, is when we start off on the external kickoff and operationalizing that partnership. So that's in brief an overview of the partnership processes that you go through should you decide to become a partner for EPA Delivery with Pearson. So again, outlining some of the working arrangements for partnerships. So from a EPA development perspective, we will have a memorandum of understanding with the providers or a consortia. We will contract with individual providers who would supply us the occupationally competent staff for feeding into our workshops for EPA development. And the kind of details that we would have within those contracts would be around the number of workshops they're expected to attend, the payment terms, duration of these workshops, and the frequency of these workshops, if that's applicable. That we will then give details of the dedicated assessment workshops and how frequent they would be having, and what are the expectations we would have from the staff who would be inputting into these workshops. And then there will be a support service and management and administration that will be provided by Pearson. From an EPA delivery perspective, we will be looking at contractual agreements with individual providers or consortia. You will have support from a lead independent assessor for planning and support around the EPA delivery on behalf of Pearson. And what that looks like would be support around EPA planning, standardization events, training events, whether face-to-face or online. And there we will have a governance oversight, as I detailed, around quality assurance, compliance, and standards as well. So roughly within those two categories of partnerships, those are the working arrangements that would be in place. So as a provider, you are probably thinking what you need to think about when you are looking at potential partnerships with Pearson, and what would be the next steps if you do want to go ahead. So some of the considerations that you should take into account before you think about partnerships is of course, the number of occupationally competent assessors you have on your books. Do they have the capacity? So you've got existing contracts for delivering training. You need to assess after taking into account the time that your occupationally competent assessors have put into training delivery. Do you have capacity or peaks and troughs where you can potentially use them for delivering EPAs for Pearson? I think we are very clear that any kind of partnership arrangements will only work if there is a if it's a win-win situation for all parties. So that would be the EPA organization, the providers or the partner organization, the training provider or the employer provider as well. So this partnership arrangement would only work if it's a win-win across all different entities involved. The location of the assessors and the geography that they can cover is also a very important part of the discussion. So that needs to be taken into consideration as well. Of course, we would be creating the job descriptions for the assessors for each of the standards. So it would, you would need to think about the kind of occupational competence they have. We would expect these assessors to be having assessor qualifications, obviously, and looking at our CPD, how do your assessor profiles actually align to the requirements that we have within our JD or within the assessment plan for that particular standard. And of course, the release of staff. So we are not proposing to actually pay the assessors for attending standardization and training meetings because we do think that that would be part of their CPD activity. So you need to make sure that you are happy to release your staff for attending these standardization and training events. So some of the win-win scenarios that I've outlined for the providers. So this is based on some of the conversations that we're having already within different parts of the country and potentially what might be coming up in the near future as well. So obviously as Pearson, we are looking for a scalable solution and within this new standards landscape, it's still a bit fuzzy as to what a scalable solution looks like. So there are potentially 3 scenarios. There might be more scenarios actually over and above these 3, but there are 3 potential scenarios that we think would work when we're looking at partnerships. The first of this is if you are working in a sector or you have very niche expertise within a sector. So as an example, healthcare science, you might be very, very good within that particular sector, and there is a huge need and a huge demand for assessors for the NHS. So that might be something that you are very good at. So that might be one of the scenarios where it would work for all entities. You might be involved in local area partnerships, which might be part of a employer board or part of the devolution agenda or the local economic partnerships. So you might be involved in a multi-party partnership within your local area, which involves employers, training providers, universities, chambers of commerce, or a combination of these. And it makes sense to actually have a partnership arrangement with that consortia of entities to have a win-win situation for all parties. Or you might be working with a lot of SMEs in your region, and typically SMEs would not have a requirement for more than 2 to 3 apprentices a year potentially. But as a provider, it would probably make sense for you to come together with your SMEs or with other providers in your region to identify if there is a scalable opportunity here, so it makes it worth your while to actually do partnership delivery with Pearson. What we are clear about is, obviously, we have got an existing standard verifier model that we use for the current work-based learning provision. And the whole idea of the partnership for endpoint assessments is so that we don't replicate that model, because obviously we think that given the new requirements of the endpoint assessments, it would make sense to have a partnership arrangement. So we are looking for a minimum bank of at least 10 to 15 assessors in order to initiate our conversations around partnerships. And these 10 to 15 assessors, they can either be across different sectors within an organization or within a consortia, or they can be 10 to 15 assessors within a particular niche area. So for example, healthcare or hospitality are 2 of the sectors which we think, if you're working in that niche, it would probably make sense to have that minimum bank within a particular sector for us to initiate the partnership dialogues with yourselves. So in terms of next steps, what can you do if you are interested and you tick all the boxes from the previous slides and you're just there, you're ready to go on the partnership conversations with us, what do you do next? So the first step is to speak to your account managers for further details. I did talk about an expression of interest form. Your account managers have these within their toolkit, so they would be happy to send that to you. We would welcome more in-depth discussions to talk about the partnership model. So if you're in a place where you think, I do want to work in partnership, but I'm not sure what that looks like. I do have different entities which fall into some of the categories that I've mentioned, but still not sure how do we articulate that into a partnership proposition. Please do speak to your account manager, and I'll be happy to have a conversation with you through a teleconference or come and visit you as well. We are more than happy to have those in-depth discussions because it is complex territory. It's not simple, it's not straightforward, and having those initial round of discussions actually help simplify or articulate a lot of these complexities in more detail. So once you've got the expression of interest form, by all means do complete it if you think that you have all the answers within those forms. Once we get that form back into us, we will carry out a due diligence process. We will have a conversation with you first before we go into the due diligence process. We will explain what that process looks like. We will send you the details that we would want from yourself as part of that due diligence process. And we would then come out and visit you maybe over a couple of days to gather and have conversations with different parts of your organization in order to carry out that due diligence process. And as I mentioned initially, we need to have an agreement in principle signed off from the ESFA on all of the partnership arrangements that we are getting into. So if you're happy with the due diligence exercise we've carried out and we want to work in partnership with yourselves, we will need to go back to the ESFA to get that signed off before we actually sign a contract with yourself. And that brings us to the end of the webinar here. So I'm just going to see if we have questions coming through. Now I'm going to refer to my...
Hi, Rahini. Yeah, we have one question. So if we are, or if we're currently another centre with another AO, would we have to move to Pearson?
No, not at all. You don't have to be a Pearson centre in order to work in partnership with us. In the expression of interest form, we do ask for the details of the awarding body that you are an approved centre for, and that we'll just take that into consideration during our due diligence process.
That's the only question we've got so far. If anybody else has got a question. Oh,
yep.
Hang on, there's another one come in.
Yep.
Where does this leave the independent self-employed assessor? Will Pearson be hiring any?
We would be potentially over the next 3 to 4 months. So on our website, you will see, you can actually search for independent assessors, and we are looking for that. So if you want to provide us with your CV directly through the website, we're more than happy to look at it. You can either send it to me as well directly, and we can give you a call to talk to you as well, because we do understand that the partnership arrangements would take a while to get initiated and start up.
There's
a few more coming on.
Okay, hang on one second.
Mm-hmm.
Regarding the 10 to 15 assessors, are you saying that you require a minimum of 10 to 15 assessors from each organisation for partnership for EPA?
If we are going to enter into a partnership with a organisation, then yes, we're looking at 10 to 15 assessors. However, if you do have contracts with employers and have visibility of a pipeline of apprentices over the next 18 months, and you think that your bank is less than 10 to 15, do have a conversation with your account manager, and we'll be happy to discuss that in more detail with you.
How are prices, fees calculated and agreed with partner organisation?
So this depends on the type of arrangements that we have with the partner organisation. So obviously we will pay the assessors for the time that they spend delivering endpoint assessments on behalf of Pearson. On top of that, if we have an arrangement with their partner organisation wherein the partner is taking on the allocation, scheduling, and a part of the conflict of interest details, then we would look at how we can compensate for that as well. So it depends on the kind of arrangements that we have with the partner organisation. The basic minimum being payments to the assessors for their time, but it can also include some compensation for the administration required.